Hello students, Mr. Young here. Welcome to Chapter 18, Lesson 4. It's called the Post-Reconstruction Era. Basically, Reconstruction ends in the first couple paragraphs of the chapter, and we go on to read about what happens as a result of, well, basically the losses of radical Republicans and therefore the end of Reconstruction. So the North had won the Civil War. We learned all about it, and ended slavery in the South. But you can't make a zebra change its stripes, at least not overnight. The South sought to keep the status quo as much as possible, but the radical Republicans enforced their will in the South, quite literally, with military occupation. But how long could they keep that up? Well, we'll find out today. In today's lesson, the Southern Democrats take back control of the South and once again seek to subjugate their former slaves. So at the federal level, Republicans began to lose control of the House and Senate. Ulysses S. Grant had won the presidential election of 1868 and even re-election in 1872, but between his lack of experience in politics, his scandal-ridden terms, and economic depression, Republicans began to lose power. In the 1874 congressional elections, Democrats took control of the House and also made gains in the Senate. Now listen well, students. Federal power is cyclical. No one party has control forever. It always swings back. It did then as it does now. You see? Blue, red, blue, red, blue, red, blue, red. And it goes on and on and on. And then even recently, during the height of the Obama years, you had Obama was president, Democrat, and then you had Democrat control of the House and Senate, and as time goes on, slowly it began to swing the other way, and now it's 2017, and Republicans have the White House with Donald Trump, and they have the House and the Senate. But undoubtedly, and maybe 4 years, maybe 6, maybe 8, maybe 10 years, it will swing back. It always swings back. So just keep that in mind. People go a little crazy. It always swings back. Now at the state level, Democrats were taking back the South with the help of groups like the KKK that terrorized blacks and Republicans alike. Basically, people that didn't want the South like them. So these Democrats that were rebuilding the South, they called themselves the Redeemers, as in they were going to redeem the old South, and they saw themselves as basically saving the South from black Republican rule. Now, let's move into the elections of 1876. The Republicans sought to keep control of the presidency by running a moderate. Now, this moderate that they ran was the Ohio governor, so Midwest governor. They were a little more moderate than, say, the radical Republicans. They ran Ohio Governor Rutherford B. Hayes. The Democrats ran New York Governor Samuel Tilden. Now, the election was very close and also a little shady, by kind of a lot shady. In basically 3 southern states, Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana, both parties claimed that their candidate had won the election there. So they didn't know who won those states, and basically whoever won those states would win the presidential election. Kind of like Florida, back when Al Gore ran against George W. Bush back in the early 2000s. Now, it was said that there was a deal struck. Basically, there was this committee appointed, and they were pretty sure that Rutherford B. Hayes won these states, which would mean he'd win the election by 1 electoral vote. But they weren't sure the Democrats would accept this result, so they promised them, hey, if you let this go through and Hayes will be president, we promise that he will withdraw federal troops from the South that have been there since the Civil War. We'll pull them out. And that's what ended up happening. In 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes takes the presidency, and very shortly after, federal troops are withdrawn from the South. That means they're not there to protect any more Republicans or African American folks. They're not there to enforce their rights anymore. You can see here the map. You can see Republican victories, Democrat victories. It's very close. And then the disputed states. There was even a dispute. There was an illegal elector over in Oregon. Okay, but that's sort of nitpicking there. All right, the rise of the New South. So by the 1880s rather, the heads of the South had decided to embrace a more industrial stance. They argued that it was the lack of industry that had made them lose the war. Indeed, that was a big disadvantage we talked about, because they didn't have very much industry, and the North did. With them blockaded, that meant that they just couldn't get the goods they needed. Now, the South made a good deal of progress in the 1880s and towards industrialization. They constructed a lot of textile mills for all that cotton. There was the American Tobacco Company in North Carolina, controlled nearly all the tobacco manufacturing in the whole country. By 1890, 20% of the nation's steel was coming out of the South. By the close of the century, not only were all the destroyed railroad lines repaired, but there were twice as many in terms of track mileage, so more railroads. That's always good. Now, the South would never become the industrial powerhouse that the North was, but there was hope that there would be small, profitable farms growing a variety of profitable crops, not just cotton. They were hoping to have basically a good economy still based on farming, where everyone would be happy little farmers like Thomas Jefferson had imagined it. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. Plantation owners held on to their large estates, and landowners, be they plantation owners or otherwise, would rent out their land to tenant farmers and sharecroppers, and it just wasn't that profitable. Small farmers and sharecroppers were in a bad position. They were going into debt. To try to work themselves out of debt, they would try to grow the most profitable crop there was, which was still cotton. So you still had basically too much cotton was planted. So with a lot of supply, but not an increasing demand, that means prices for cotton would drop. So now they're making less money on the cotton they're planting. It was sort of this terrible cycle of debt that just kept occurring, and that's why agriculture never really thrived in the South during the Reconstruction era. That brings us to a divided society. So basically, with Democrats regaining control of those Southern governments, taking them away from the Republicans for a number of reasons. Number one, people, when one party in power for too long, they tend to get too big for their britches. Things like corruption, and when things go wrong, the Republicans are in control, so it must be their fault. And then you had groups like the KKK scaring Republicans and African Americans from voting. The people that had refused to vote before had candidates they liked running, things like that. So they start to take back control of state governments. Some other factors would be things like basically initiatives to prevent African Americans from voting, who always at the time voted Republican. So one way that Southern governments were able to basically suppress the black vote was a poll tax. Basically, they made you pay to vote, and if basically a lot of poor black folk couldn't afford a poll tax, so they just couldn't vote anymore. Another means to suppress vote was a literacy test, where they often made you basically take a test on either the state or federal constitution. It was somewhat complex, and a lot of black folks still didn't know how to read. They were only just been free, they'd only just been allowed to start learning how to read, and it was either too hard or they couldn't read. So that helped Democrats regain control. There was also the problem with these laws is there's a lot of poor white farmers that couldn't read or write, and they voted Democrat. So the Democrats still wanted those votes, so they created what's called a grandfather clause. Basically, if your grandfather or dad had voted, basically this is before the Civil War, then you were exempt from poll taxes or literacy tests. And by making these laws, they basically circumvented the 15th Amendment that said you can't bar people voting based on race. And they were also able to circumvent, with the grandfather clause, these rules picking up poor whites by accident. So in that way, they were able to increase their turnout for people likely to vote for them and suppress Republican turnout. Very tricky moves. That brings us to Jim Crow laws. Basically, the spiral continues downward. By the end of the 1800s, many segregation laws, which are also known as Jim Crow laws, made it so that blacks and whites had to be separated in most public spaces throughout the South, like train cars and public buildings and schools and things like that. This segregation laws were actually taken to the Supreme Court in 1896 with a famous decision, Plessy v. Ferguson, which the court upheld segregation laws so long as facilities were separate but equal, and this basically upheld segregation laws in the South for the next half century. So it was supposed to be separate but equal, but it was definitely separate but seldom equal, as in states usually spent a lot more money on white facilities than African American facilities. On top of this segregation, you had violence. There's no federal troops there anymore to protect them. Their rights are being taken away. So you had lynch mobs would often basically illegally kill African American folks if they were accused of a crime, or they were suspected of a crime, or even if they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. So as we can all see, the South was quickly becoming a sectastic place to live if you were a black person. So they started to leave. Sounds like a good idea. Many headed to Kansas. They were called the Exodusters. It's a plan on the Jews in Egypt escaping their slavery. In the book of Exodus in the Bible, so they were called Exodusters. Many African Americans, men particularly, joined the military, where they joined segregated units to fight the Indian Wars of the late 1800s. The Apache and Cheyenne called them Buffalo Soldiers, and they would fight all over the West, and even places like Hawaii, Cuba, the Philippines, and Mexico. Buffalo Soldiers are pretty cool. I believe there's some good movies out there about the Buffalo Soldiers. So overall, we're drawing to the close of the chapter here. What was the impact of Reconstruction? Well, the South was rebuilt, for some. Track had been relaid, cities had been rebuilt, industry was growing, agriculture was still dominant, but it wasn't very profitable, and African Americans had been freed and for a moment had a big role in the political process, a big role in government, but now that was regressed and that was being taken away. W.E.B. Du Bois said it best, this quote. It was in the book, and I was like, wow, that pretty much sums it up. The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back again towards slavery. We talked about that cycle of sharecropping and tenant farming that most freedmen were kind of forced into, and how it was basically one step above slavery. They were kind of still slaves. It would be a long fight for equality for African Americans, particularly in the South. That's the end of the chapter. Next up, we're moving west. We're basically going to have cowboys, Indians, and farmers. And that's where we're going. That would be chapter 19. There's 4 lessons. Tomorrow you have study day, then we'll have the test on Reconstruction, and then we'll be moving on to the next chapter. For today, you have a standard quiz, 10 points, 2 attempts, 5 questions, multiple choice, some more Buffalo Soldiers. Rolling on the Cav. Alright, hey, if you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, have a great day.